All right, guys, we're gonna get started with our lecture. So welcome back. This week we're gonna be learning about CSS positioning and centering. Just some quick announcements though. Homework four, which is released today, will be due next Thursday. Lab 3 will be due next Monday, and then we're releasing the midterm project today. And you can read more about that on the spec that's released on Notion. Basically, check-ins will be due next Thursday, where we're basically asking you to make like a Figma mock-up of what you want your website to look like. And then you can just basically bring it into office hours and then we'll check you off. And a reminder, 5 mandatory attendances for lecture. And then if you don't come, we'll give you a no pass. Yeah, so the midterm project has been released on Notion. You're basically creating a website from scratch that pertains to the given theme. So in this iteration of the course, we're remaking Gypsy's website from, like an Asian ghetto. So yeah, create a high fidelity mockup by instead of Monday, it's Thursday next week. And then get it checked off during TA office hours to get 4 points in your project. And if you don't come, then your maximum score will be 24 out of 28. And then don't start coding the project until you've been checked off, just because we want to check out your design first. All right, yeah, so we can get into it. Recall our HTML skeleton from last week. It's important to think of like the divs as containers and like parent-child hierarchies. So for example, the H1 tag is like a child within the header, and the header is a child of the div, and the div is a child of the body when we're looking at like the first top 4 tags that we see. So think of these in like parent-child hierarchies. When we have content, we position them relative to their containers, and their containers are like their parents, basically. So I guess, yeah, the big deal about divs and boxes is positioning. So when we position things, I'm sure you guys have seen when we just position things normally without any CSS, the elements just kind of go like one by one right below each other. When we position things, we take them out of like the normal flow of the elements. So these are the 4 positions that you're gonna have. Static is the default positioning that we've seen during like all of the assignments so far in this class. And that kind of just positions the elements according to the default flow, where like you position one below the other and then keep on going. Position relative positions the element according to the normal flow and then offsets it relative to where it should be in that normal flow. The offset doesn't affect any of the surrounding elements. So say you have like one element and then another element below it. If you take like the top element and position it relative, that does not affect the element below that at all. Position absolute takes the element outside of the normal flow completely and positions it relative to the closest position ancestor. We'll get more into that after. Yeah, and then position fixed is basically pulling an element out of the normal flow and then positioning relative to like the window or the viewport. That's where you might see like some nav bars or like things that are always on the top of the viewport. Yeah, so we can get into default positioning first. Nothing new here. It's just like the divs like right below, like one by one right below each other. This is like the display block where you can see like each one is displayed one below each other. Yeah, this has been like the positioning you guys have been working with just with HTML in general. So yeah, we can get into position relative. So as I said before, positions the element according to normal flow and then offsets it relative to itself, as in like where it should have been if it was just flowing normally. And the offset doesn't affect any of the surrounding elements. So I think this would be best demonstrated with like an example. So say we take like the box B and then we have position relative. So this is like the same CSS property and value that we've seen before. And then top 20 pixels. So we add 20 pixels on the top between where it should have been and then where it is now. And we add 30 pixels on the left of where it should have been, where it is now. So something that kind of demonstrates it is that think of like the blue line here as where it would have been in the normal flow if we just had A, B, and C. By putting position relative and then top 20 pixels, we're going to push it down by 20 pixels and also to the left by 30 pixels. And as you can see by C, just because we like moved B to be relative positioning, C is not affected at all. And also A isn't affected either. Yeah, so this is another example of what we might want to do. It doesn't look very good, but if we have position relative, we add like 50 pixels on the left and we want to say put B slightly above, then we can do bottom 20 pixels to increase the offset by 20 from the bottom. Yeah, this is pretty much the same thing. Do you guys have any questions so far about relative positioning? All right. So yeah, position absolute is when the element is completely pulled out of the flow and is positioned relative to its closest relatively positioned ancestor. An example that demonstrates this is something like this, except that even though we did position absolute and right 0 pixels and top 0 pixels, it didn't seem to work just because like the red box is like in the very upper right corner for some reason. That's because it broke because we didn't have like the container to be position relative. So whenever we use absolute positioning, the parent always has to be position relative as well. So yeah, when we have content, we position them relative to their containers. So in order to properly position B, we have to do like the overall container, which is like the gray outline of the box. Say that's position relative. And then for all the elements within that container, position absolute will refer to that box as its like closest ancestor, like relatively positioned. So position absolute right 0 pixels and top 0 pixels positions it relative to that to the gray box, but on the right there's no pixels in between the B and the right of the gray box, and between like the top there's no pixels there either. Yeah, so I guess if you wanted to put things on top of each other for some reason, you can also do position absolute to multiple elements. So here we still have the container position relative, and say we want to have all 3 of these for some reason be right on top of each other. That's where you can pretty much put position absolute in the CSS selector for A, B, and C. Yeah, so that basically layers stuff on top of each other. And think of like the blue line here as like the origin of where you're positioning relative to. Yeah, so if I guess in this example, position absolute, I guess the default is 0 pixels and 0 pixels. So since they're all absolutely positioned, it'll put it right at the upper left corner for all of them. Yeah, so here's an example of Airbnb's website where it's kind of useful to think of things in terms of like relative and absolute positioning. So if we think of the entire screen as like the relatively positioned container, which is a very like common thing you see in web development, then if you want to highlight like the white box, then that's where you use absolute positioning to put the sign up form in that area. And then for everything like within that white box, everything that's positioned within it is positioned relative to the absolutely positioned white box. So it's kind of interesting where like if you relative or like absolute position an element, then whatever you put inside that element, all the like if you put absolute positioning within it, then it references the absolutely positioned ancestor, if that makes sense. Like absolute and relative when thinking of like what the ancestor is, function the same way, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, so a third position is position fixed, and this is when you pull it out of the normal flow and then position it kind of relative to like the window or the viewport. The viewport, if you guys are wondering, is like the size of your screen. So when you're doing CSS, if you do like 100 VH, that's like viewport height, which is basically like the height of your screen, and then VW is like viewport width, which is like the width of your screen. So yeah, when we do like window or viewport, it's like synonymous. But this is basically where say we have like this nav bar that we want to put at the top, and regardless of where you scroll, you still want the nav bar to be there. So we would do like .nav and then position fixed, left 0 pixels and top 0 pixels, so it always stays in that upper left corner and spreads across the screen. And then still A, B, and C position relative. The boxes aren't really important for this example. But yeah, so say like if we look at the scroll bar on the very right of the screen, say we scroll up, then we see that the nav bar is still like position fixed because it's always staying at the top of the screen. And then everything else just functions as like a normal page where you can just scroll up and down. Yeah, so that's position fixed. Yeah, we also have this on our website where the red box at the top of the screen is position fixed. So regardless of how far you scroll, it'll always stay at the top of the screen. I think there's like a cancel button though. So when you click cancel, then it disappears. Oh, yeah, centering, very important part of the class. If we want to horizontally center like block elements, I think we covered this a little bit last class, but just to solidify a bit more, we could do margin right auto and margin left auto. So that basically takes like the width of the element and then automatically positions the left and right margins so that it's centered within, like horizontally centered within the page. Another shorthand way of doing this is margin zero auto. The zero basically referring to like the top and bottom margin, and then auto is like the left and right. So as you see, like we apply the left and right auto, left and right for margin to be auto. So we do margin zero auto, it takes away the top and bottom margin and then puts auto on the sides. You can replace zero with like whatever top and bottom margin that you want. Just know that this is, I guess, a shorthand way of doing it. And then if we want to vertically center like block elements with absolute positioning, so say we have like this big potato with width 100 pixels and height 50 pixels. So we want to like center it vertically. So we want it like somewhere along that center line for the, I guess, the y-axis. What we do is like position absolute and then top 50%. So 50% is 50% of like the gray outline. So we take like half of the box and put the big potato like 50% below since it's absolute position. But this isn't like completely centered. So what we want to do afterwards is this transform translate y negative 50%. So transform is basically like a property that you might see a lot. It has a lot to do with some CSS animations that you might see in like 2 lectures from now. But just know for now that transform can be used to, I guess, translate elements up and down or left and right. So in this case, we're translating y, and then the negative 50%. Negative means like you're moving it up. So we saw like top 50% moves it 50% down, and then negative 50% moves it 50% up. But the 50% is relative to the size of the big potato. So think of it as if we're at this position, we want to move half of the big potato above like this middle gray line, right? So if we do negative 50%, that moves half of the potato up, and then it's perfectly like vertically centered. We can center things too. So the same thing applies to if you want to center things in the X direction as well. If we want to do like center, we do position absolute top 50%, left 50%, and then that'll basically position it so like all of the yellow potato is like in like this quadrant right here. And then we have like the transform translate property. Negative 50% refers to the X direction, and then negative 50% refers to the Y direction. So that's basically taking into account like the first one is the width, the second one is the height. And by doing this, you basically position it right in the center. Just a quick note though, that when you do like transform translate, say we had like a property like transform translate Y, and then right below that you do transform translate without like anything, you can only assign one value to a certain CSS property at a time. So what you do like in the like below the transform translate Y will override the original instruction. Just a note, so that you don't try to like do transform translate X and then transform translate Y, because the translate Y will override the X. So if you want to do X and Y, then just use the transform translate because that'll take into account both at once. Yeah.
So when we do position absolute, we can't do like margin auto. Is it only for position?
I think margin auto just works for anything that has a defined width. Usually if we want to do position absolute and we want to center it, if we're already given that the thing is position absolutely, then we would do like top left transform translate. If we only want to center it in like horizontally, then we do margin zero auto. Yeah, if that answers your question. Yeah. Oh yeah. Let's see. So auto, based for margin right auto, it automatically positions the right margin so that it's centered. Margin left auto, it automatically positions the left margin that is centered. Margin zero auto, this is like a shorthand way where the zero is referring to like the top and bottom margin. It can be like whatever margin you want on the top and bottom, and then auto is applied to the left and right. So this is basically a shorthand way of doing like margin right auto, margin left auto, margin top zero, margin bottom zero. And you can replace the zero with whatever you want. All right. Let's see. Oh, yeah, so just some miscellaneous things. Sometimes you want certain things to be above other things. So in this case, B is above like the A element just because B happens to be like below A in the CSS. The way CSS works is like cascading styling sheets. So it takes like the first rule and then goes to the next rule and then it keeps on going down and down. So whichever rule, say like you have another dot A like below this dot C. If you have another dot A, then that'll override everything in here, or like it'll override any properties that are the same as the properties defined in here. So since B is below A in the CSS, the B is positioned above the A. So if we want to fix that, we can use something like a Z index, where Z index is basically a number that indicates how high on the screen something is. And it's all relative to like what other Z indexes are. So I think Z index 0 is the default. So everything starts as Z index 0. If we want A on top of that, we can do Z index 1, and then that'll put A on top of B. And then, yeah, you can basically do Z index whatever. You can have like 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to like whatever you want. And that'll overlay them in the way that you want to, which bigger numbers corresponding to be like higher on the screen. Oh yeah. Is there any questions? Like Z index 2 here? Since 2 is greater than 0, A will still be above 0. It's all like whether one index is greater than the other. Like you could put Z index 1000, it'll have like the same effect, like as the first one. Yeah.
So if we want to like, if I want to use like position absolute,
Mhm.
like the ancestor to be like relative, or can it be like fixed or absolute again?
The ancestor has to be relative or absolute. So as we saw, let's see. Going back to the Airbnb example. So like this is like a relatively positioned container. And then the white box is like absolutely positioned relative to the overall container that we saw in the previous screen here. And then say we want to like organize the elements like highlighted in like this blue area. When we do position absolute within this green box, everything is positioned relative to this green box, even though this green box has like position absolute. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, cool. We can go into the design section now. And Kelly, who is not here, so we have Kelly Tran stepping in. Yeah.
All right. Hello. Hello, everyone. We'll be going over color theory today. Nothing too crazy, but some really cool things you can learn about color theory and how it applies to UI and UX design. So let's go over some basic terminology first. The three terms we're going to go over are hue, value, and saturation. Also, sometimes you see these abbreviated as HSV when you're looking at a color scheme. So hue is just what colors are. So anything on the rainbow scale, like RGB, bev, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, etc. So as you can see right here, these are hues. Values are how bright a color is. So the brighter something is, the more like, I guess, lighter. You can think of it as like light and dark. That's like how I like to think of values. So the brighter something is, the closer it is going to be to like this top area, whereas like darker something is, it's obviously going to add more black to it. So it gets less bright and then the value is decreased. And then for saturation, that's essentially how intense a color is. If a color is at 100% like intensity, that'll be like all the way over here, where that's essentially like the hue color. And if it's like not very intense at all, the saturation is really little, it's basically kind of like a grayscale. So those three are the terms that you need to understand. And some more examples. This is more saturated over here with the brighter blue, and then least saturated is over here with the lighter blue. And then there's also shade and tint, which is basically to do with adding more like dealing to do with the values and the brightness. So now that we understand how colors are broken down into, how do we pick which colors to use? So many of you guys have probably know like the color wheel. This is just the basic color wheel. Probably have seen this before. There are a lot of relationships that you can be seeing in the color wheel. So we have complementary, which are just opposite two colors, one another. In this example, we have orange and blue. It could be red and green, yellow and purple. Triadic is three colors equally spaced around the wheel, which kind of form a triangle. As you can see, we have the red over here, the orange, yellow, and then this blue. And then analogous is just a side by side, just any colors that are next to each other. Any questions so far? Pretty straightforward stuff. And here's some more relationships between the color wheels. We also have split complementary, which is just any color, they're complementary, and then the two colors next to it. We have tetradic, which is just like triadic, but with four colors, just evenly spaced around the color wheel. And then monochromatic, which is just shades and tint of a color. And then there's a lot of like color palette generators that you can find on the internet. Here's one, colors.muse.li. My personal favorite will be coolers or colors.co. You probably have seen this one. It's pretty popular, and it basically generates like 5 colors you use and their hex value down here. Another one you can use is gradients.io, which gives you a gradient, as you can see. So if you're ever looking to make a gradient as like the background for say on a website, this is a great website to look at. Now, how do we apply these colors? And like, what do the colors tell us? It's all about the vibes, you know? So red is a very emotionally tense color. When you see red, it is very bright, it's out there, and it can connect your urges to order that pizza on DoorDash. Or maybe you keep swiping right on Tinder because you're so lonely and it's cuffing season. Red is very useful for important actions in UX. As you can see here in this first picture, that disable card is in red because that's something that's a very like, you want to like highlight that. It's something like, oh, you don't want to disable your card unless you really need to. So it's a strong and kind of like a bold emotion evoking color. Another color that's kind of the opposite of that is blue. It's pretty common in a lot of logos, example Zoom, PayPal, Visa, Chase. It's very reliable. You kind of depend on blue. It's easier to see on the eyes and very suitable just for general purpose things. And blue is considered a color of trust and rapport. So that's why you can see like a lot of banks use it, I believe. And yeah, Zoom, PayPal. Yellow, on the other hand, is very bright and it's very attention grabbing. When you first look at yellow, it probably grab your attention first because it's so bright. And the Amazon logo right here, like if you guys have the Amazon app, it's like kind of a trap because all of their like add to cart, their checkout buttons are all in yellow, but that's because they're there to grab your attention and they want you to add it to cart. They want you to buy that item. So, and that's how Amazon makes their money. It's very vibrant, attention grabbing color, and it's all color theory. So yeah, there's definitely more colors that are associated with like emotions and stuff, and you can definitely look into that. But now let's get into some practical applications and how we can use these tips in web design. So something really important in like when you're building a website is contrast between colors. In this example right here, this is kind of what you don't want to do. As you can see, the colors are very like bright and they're very out there, very contrasting. But it's not done in a way that seems very like, it's not easy on the eye, it's not really easy to read. And that's something we want to try to avoid. Another thing is accessibility. Some people are like red, green color blindness, let's say, and the contrast between that could also play an issue. So that's why contrast is a big thing. A good way to check if your colors have a good contrast is this website right here, accessible-colors.com. And it basically takes whatever colors you have, it desaturates them. So like, as we talked about before, saturation is just like how intense the color is. It takes away the intensity of the color, but it leaves behind the brightness. And that's what we're looking at in contrast. So we're just comparing basically like a white to black with the grayscale value. And if it's a good contrast that makes it easy to read, then that's kind of a good contrast. That's the color scheme you like, that would be good for a site. Any questions so far? Awesome. Here's another example, like basically in the first example, it moves too fast, but it desaturates and it's not really easy to tell that triangle. But once we change the colors to be a little more saturated, and intense, the contrast definitely is different and it's easier to look at on the eyes. And another thing is like a lot of people and a lot of websites, a lot of designers, they don't use pure black just because a lot of times when you're looking at like a black background or black screen, pure black at least, it absorbs like all of the light, like there's no light emitting from it. So it's harder on the eyes and it actually makes it a little harder to read for some people. So a lot of times, a lot of designers will use like 333, which is like a dark gray or like, so you can kind of just use a lot of variations of gray instead of black, but that's one tip definitely I would give. So now that we've gone over different colors and how to like get a color scheme, for example, here's a little color scheme we generated with colors.co. Let's try to build a site. So here's an example of a site that's very colorful. We use the colors from the color palette that we just generated, right? And while like everything, but it seems like everything's out there. You know, we have a yellow background, which like I said, is very vibrant. It catches your attention, but also like we have that red on top, but it seems to be like contrasting in a way that isn't really, I guess, great on the eyes, not very aesthetically pleasing. I don't know. It's the red, yellow, and blue color scheme that's not working out. So here's a way to improve that. While we do continue with the original color palette of those 5 colors, those red, green, yellow, blue, you see how we kept the red like sidebar, but instead of having that yellow background being so contrasting against the eyes, we used a white background with black text, black gray text, and we use basically variations of gray for a lot of our text and buttons, which is something you'll find very common on sites. You don't usually find a very colored background. Like if, for example, I think Slack is a great, if you guys have used Slack, the backgrounds are usually like gray or like white or like black, depending on like if you have dark mode on or something, but it's much easier on the eyes since the contrast between that white and the blue is much easier than this yellow and the blue. And you can also see how we have kind of accent colors for our little notifications for like engineering, the like 4, we use that green from the original color palette, this one. So we end up still using that color palette, but it's more of like a color scheme that you've expanded. You have like 5 grays-ish, and then you have variations of the yellow used in the little error kind of like notification, which is a good way to kind of catch like someone's attention without making it too out there. And then I don't know if you can see it here. I think I have to move this, but the little red, the red from the color scheme ends up being just a small part for the notice. So the red will catch your eye, but it's not too out there, like in here where it's like the entire bar. So yeah, does anyone have any questions on why we like this design better, or like why this is just the practice, I guess? No? Awesome. Another thing to note is like if you're ever adding images to your website, it's really good if you can, if possible, match your color scheme with your images, because it does make your site just more cohesive. As you can see here, we have these 3 colors that like seem to match with one another. And even though it doesn't seem that way at first, like the website still looks pretty cohesive, even though we have all these colors from everywhere. And it makes the website just look a little bit more put together, more just aesthetically pleasing, as I like to say. So